Welcome to the interview series. The interview series is a production of the Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit 1 Week Critique, 1WC, which provides pedagogical resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about our programs, support our work, and view the comparative texts of our interviewees' work by visiting www.oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1weekcritique.com. I'm al-Sirgany, here today with Elizabeth Geoghegan. Elizabeth Geoghegan was born in New York, raised in the Midwest, and has spent the last 2 decades living in Rome. She is the author of the story collection 8ball, recently released in Spanish translation as Bola Ocho, and the best-selling flash memoir, The Marco Chronicles. Geoghegan's work has appeared in the Paris Review, Bomb, El País, The Best Travel Writing, Time, Words Without Borders, Poets and Writers, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Hi, Adam. So nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Today we're going to be looking.
Good job on pronouncing my surname. Very good.
Nailed it.
You did. You did.
Today we'll be looking at the development of Treeboy, the first from Elizabeth's aforementioned collection 8ball. So we're not likely to cover the entirety of both of these texts, and there are some exciting things to cover here. I'm going to encourage listeners to visit our website, oneweekcritique.com, if they'd like a closer look and to study Elizabeth's work. But meanwhile, Elizabeth, would you mind summarizing the plot of Treeboy a little bit for our listeners?
No, not at all. Thanks. So Treeboy is set in a graduate art program in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. And although a school is never named, it's just a sort of fictional MFA program. And it's a story of obsession, and the narrator is a photographer, and she's obsessed with a guy who we only ever get to know as Treeboy. And he's so called because he is in fact a tree trimmer, but he also, and he's from the Pacific Northwest, and he also uses wood and burns all of his artwork so that there's never anything that remains of it after the fact. And he's a bit of a star, let's say, in this grad program. So he's the one everybody wants, and he's the one everybody, at least if they don't want him, they want to impress him. And so she has a bit of an obsession with this guy, but really, I would say at its core, the story is about looking and seeing. And this narrator is trained to look, right? And she has a discerning eye because she's a photographer, but yet she chooses not to see certain things. And I think of it really a lot as a story, formally speaking, as a story about how we frame narrative and what's captured within the frame, metaphorically speaking, as if it were a photograph, what we would see. And what can't possibly get into that one frame that is the story, right? And so I don't know, so in the sense of her being a character who is trained to see, she's not blind to this guy's flaws, but she's blindly willing to follow him into compromising situation. And so at that point, the reader's thinking, no, don't get in the truck. No, don't go into the woods. So I guess that kind of sums it up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot to get into about all of that, but maybe the place to start is to ask you to read a little bit from Treeboy in its earlier version.
Treeboy shows up late for class, tight white t-shirt and steel toe boots, his work pants washed soft and stained with tree gum. I have seen him wield a chainsaw, and I've heard him go on about early photography, Talbot, Cartier-Bresson. He tells me about the places he's lived, but I can only envision him near the Pacific, a life on the Olympic Peninsula, the scarred legacy of logging trucks and poverty. I had imagined our encounter and examined it, developed it in the wash, lifting it with wooden tongs and turning it over and over, watching the image rise up in the rush of water, contact sheets tacked to my wall, each miniature black and white a part of the narrative, tiny arrows luring me forward, 4, 5, 6, 7, propelling me into the story. He gently pulls me into the water beside him. Seattle feels benign after Chicago, too green and too pretty, and in spite of the music it was famous for, too sedate. There is a sinister side, but it's camouflaged behind the blooming wisteria, the innocuous bungalows built on its hills. Like Mount Rainier, I only catch glimpses of it. Endless misty months and so many bodies of water, a wrong turn, and I find myself on a long bridge, bearing it out until I can turn back on the other shore. My internal compass useless. No single lake to define east, almost as if there is no east. No light rising at dawn, only the occasional flash of color, fog lifting late on a summer evening, and the ache of an overdue sunset disappearing into the sound. I wait for his kiss.
So thank you for reading that. I think that does give us a good taste of how the original version works, but also I think the flow of how Treeboy operates a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
A good sense of your writing. So I noted too, the most sort of PG version of why 8-ball is titled 8-ball is that there are 8 stories in it. Of course, there are not PG versions of why it's called 8-ball. It is a book, as noted in a particular blurb, that it is a book full of Fellini-esque characters, some of them living through parts of the 80s and 90s. But many of the folks in that book are also, they're young adults. They're mostly young women who are stumbling and sort of jogging and jarring their way through negotiations of love, of sex, of early careers, of drugs, and an increasingly globalized world, which I think becomes a particular part of that book. In the Bali story, and
right,
in a Roman story, but you told me that Treeboy was one of the first of those 8 stories that you worked on, and it was last edited by your mentor, Lucia Berlin. So in the final book version, you have about 9 pages, a little less. But it took you something like 15 years to get through this work, right?
I mean, I don't know if it was 15, but many years, yeah. Because I started and stopped and put it away and pulled it back out and tinkered with it here and there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by that, right? Especially my own students have always been like, some of it's that most of my students have been young. And I'm like, I've got to get this published now and this done now. I'm wondering if you can talk about the trajectory of the story, but also how it manifested toward a collection, because I maybe wrongly associate the narrator here with the narrator that ends the book later on, probably because of the Brownie camera and the film. But rather than ramble at you about a book you wrote.
No, that's true. And there are a lot of like touchstones of photography and other things that kind of reoccur throughout the series of stories, which is partially because I wrote it over such a long amount of time that certain things obviously obsess me and end up in the stories. But also, I don't think you're too far off about the narration.
Sure.
Because the age is similar as well of those characters.
So would you mind speaking a little bit about how Treeboy developed from whatever it started as toward being the lead off for this collection?
Sure. And something you said also kind of, these are sort of like analog stories, they really, a lot of them occur in a time before technology and speed, and maybe that speaks to a little bit about your students and my students. And it's so easy to submit a story now, you just upload it, right? But we used to have to mail it and wait months and months to hear back. And, you get that envelope in the mail with the stamp. And so, yeah, the Treeboy is still a product of my kind of initiation as a writer, which was, in the mid 90s when I worked with Lucia Berlin, which was just a great, and the great good fortune of my sort of writing program was that she ended up being my mentor and my teacher. And I had never heard of her. And she was listed as to be announced as my professor. And we were instant friends. But so the there's a kind of irony there because she's a great short story writer, a master really, and I was trying to write a novel the whole time we knew each other. And just before she died, I put my novel aside, and I thought I would try to write a couple of stories. And I had an idea for maybe what we would call now a novel and linked stories, but no one was really kind of doing that so much yet. And so it was going to be called The Book of Boys. And each story was a different boy, and maybe the same protagonist or narrator. I hadn't quite gotten that far, but I had a list and of boys to be written about. And the first one I wrote was Cricket Boy, but I wrote that very quickly in a sort of fever dream or something, and it really was something I did in almost one sweep. But Treeboy, when I wrote it and I sent it to Lucia, I was living in Rome then, and she was very sick, and I was always hesitant to send her my work because of her, it was the end of her life, and she had a lot to do, and I didn't want to take up her time, but I wanted her to see it because I was like, oh, I think I wrote a story. I really felt like it was, in truth, my first short story.
Yeah.
So I'm a little protective of it, but that doesn't answer your question really. But so it came about as what was going to be part of a series. But I think, what happened was that I just, I realized at the time, I thought maybe it would be easier to write stories than longer form writing, a novel. And what I suddenly understood that maybe everybody who had gone to graduate school with me who was working on short stories knew all along was that they're actually quite difficult to get right because the precision involved. And so Treeboy, I I often write based on sound,
Mm.
and so there's a kind of lyric quality that I was going for in the story, and so most of the cuts, even the framing device, in some ways, I felt kind of had to come out because um, as I would read it over and over and over out loud, they were like when you read it as text, it kind of is interesting on the page, but when you read it out loud and you hear it, they're not like a supporting chorus. They're sort of interrupting the music of the story, or the music of the narrative. So that was one reason why I made some of the cuts I did in terms of form. But now I've forgotten what you asked me.
Oh no, I think you've answered that largely though. I've been interested in sort of how that came about, and it's how this story came about and what its sort of, you know, personal trajectory
Right.
was. And I think that, I mean, it's amazing to hear a little bit about sort of mentorship guiding that process, but also I'm eager to get more into, I operate so heavily in sound and like,
Yeah. I know you're a musician, aren't you?
yeah. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, I played the sax and the flute for
Me
years.
too.
Oh, that's really cool. Which one?
Alto. I mean, I don't
Oh,
play anymore, but I did.
yeah. But yeah, that it gets stuck in your ears, and there are some writers who are really remarkable writers who I struggle to read because when I read them aloud, there's something too prosy about it. It's stilted and it like
Hmm.
jars me. One thing I really loved about this book was actually um, exactly that, that it's lovely to read out loud. It took me forever to read this book because I read it very slowly out loud, and there's such lovely lyric sentences that said, it might
Thank
be
you.
good to engage with some of what they finally end up looking like, which is my
Okay. Yeah.
transition to, would you mind reading from the final version of Treeboy, or the book version?
No, I would.
Cool.
So we climb into his truck. He turns the key in the ignition, then shuts it off, leans close, and looks at me for a long time. Just when I think he's finally going to kiss me, he reaches over and locks my door. He starts the motor again and shifts into gear, waiting until we get to the end of the block before turning on the lights, one beam weaker than the other, peering down the deserted street. We cross a bridge, then another, heading out of the city. Trees thicken along the roadway. When he reaches to downshift, his hand brushes my leg. Listen, he says, and I do listen, only I'm listening the way I listen to the songs on a CD that precede the one I really want to hear. He tells me about the painter he fell in love with, not for her brushstroke, which was brilliant, but for her soft Kentucky lilt with her long honeyed pauses, her penchant for the term daddy. How he cheated on his girlfriend of 7 years to pursue her, how it all began and how it ended, how the painter was sleeping with his favorite professor and how she followed that same professor on a Fulbright to Italy. But by then it was too late. His girlfriend had tossed everything he ever cherished onto the driveway in the rain. For weeks, she backed her car over his possessions, over his portfolio, and even over the photos he had taken of her. Ruined drawings catching on fence posts, crumpled slides collecting with the mud and the trash along the curbs and in the drains. How what remained was eventually ground into the pavement or vanquished by moss, fecund green tendrils reclaiming the memory of who he used to be. So you were in Italy, I say. Treeboy drums his fingers on the steering wheel and the lame headlight blinks out as if in response. Sharp curves in the dark, air forcing its way through the window and rattling the glass, the hermetic strip flapping against the door. For a moment, the trees open up, and even at night, I can see that the hillside has been devastated with logging, only the stumps left behind, forlorn as headstones amidst the furrow of tire tracks. He pulls onto a dirt road. Scrub and branches drag against the underside of the pickup, and we bump slowly along. I watch his hands opening and closing around the wheel. He kills the engine, and we roll to a stop. He gets out and shuts the door. My dog leaps out of the back, and they both disappear in the darkness. Traitor, I think. I lift up the lock and feel for the handle. It comes off in my hand. I stare at it for a second, then put it on the dash and roll down my window. Twigs crunch underneath his boots as he comes around to my side. He opens the door and I hop down, nearly falling into his arms. Warm air and the feel of his hands, the smell of damp earth and fresh laundry, the smell of him. Rocks ping, scattering as we walk further and further into the trees. The dog's collar jingles as she trots on ahead. A bird lifts from its perch in the darkness, limbs rustling. When we come out of the woods, the low red moon shimmers on the lake. I remember reading somewhere that seeing the moon's reflection on water has long been considered a cure for hysteria. I almost laughed, but now I want him more than ever. Each detail of his betrayal only made me desire him more. I heard it as a kind of confession, him realizing that he had gotten it all wrong, like he'd adjusted the aperture to finally put me in focus. And I don't care where he's been, whether it was Italy or nowhere. And I don't care who or how many he's fucked if it means that now I am in the center of the frame.
Man, that is a heartrending ending. It does not get particularly better for her.
No.
I want to put off asking questions about how that came about and the choices you made there. To say that maybe, or indirectly, to look at something more formal that leads us there, right? Like,
Okay.
maybe the more obvious or the most obvious change that happens across the course of this story in versions is that you do have that frame you mentioned removing, and that you mentioned getting in the way of sort of the sound of things,
Mm-hmm.
the visual aspect. You also I mean, you have some sort of parentheticals that folks can see if they go take a
Mm-hmm.
look. I think of that that back and forth that you do in the first version is sort of thought weaving, right? It puts the character into a sort of temporal space, right?
Yes.
A future time. Whatever's happened with Treeboy has already happened, and
Yes.
the past tense is a literal past tense, and so we're moving in
Mm-hmm.
two different past tense paces, one which is a narrative pace and one which is a maybe more of a motive traumatic pace
Mm-hmm.
that interjects into the story. Um, what ends up happening after this is the way I'd written to you, it's at best unpleasant sex. It's plausibly sexual assault. It's a little hard to parcel out, and either way, the narrator's clearly left feeling uncomfortable and disenchanted by the entire experience.
Right.
To achieve that, you've not only removed that frame and those sort of like insertions of memory and flashes of imagery and sort of torturous moment interjectors into the story.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to get that right and figure out how to articulate how that works, so I'm hoping you'll be able to.
I'll try.
You've also, I mean, you've extended this scene quite a bit and changed where it ends. So interestingly, the portion that is sex as sex kind of is briefer.
Mm-hmm.
The lead up to the sex is longer
Mm-hmm.
and has qualities of dark romance about it,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think,
Disturbing.
yeah, it's so disturbing, and it makes me feel as though the narrator is a little less naive about him. Leaves me feeling oddly more enchanted by him, which I'll explore on my own time. But my sort of two-part question to you is, would you mind sharing a little bit more about why you've removed the frame, and then would you mind sharing about the sort of intentions that you're aiming for and the things that you actually extended and
Sure.
pushed and pulled with in that molding?
Sure, I'll try. Thank you. That's really it's really fun to talk about this story. Thank you so much. Um I did write it such a very long time ago, really. And there's something, in it still for me that when I read it, I'm like, oh wow. Um Sometimes things come together in a way that's very mysterious. And I always do think that writing, as much as we can talk about craft, there's a certain amount of mystery. Um, and and a lot of that also has to do with that idea of music, where for me I kind of hear what I need to write next. And so when I'm really in the zone, I hear it. And the rest of the time it's just moving sentences around on the page. But to speak about the frame more in a more concise way, I think the backstory is that when I always tend to have these really elaborate formal concepts, like these high concepts, high, like kind of unachievable maybe. But I think I read Cortázar, hopscotch, like too early in my life, or too close to when I became a writer, or and
Yeah.
I'm always trying to do these things with jump cuts in time, um, and present and past tense being told always in the present tense. And so it's tricky, and so I think what I wanted in this, with the original frame, what I wanted was for those one liners that show up as italics in the first draft or in the early draft to be enticing and kind of beautiful, right? And so at the beginning, he gently pulls me into the water. Beside him is the first line. At a certain point, we circle back and we meet that line again in the text at the very end. And it's like he pulls me into the water beside him. but it becomes gently
Yeah.
into the water beside him, right? And that gently, that word gently, it's like actually the end of tenderness in the story, if there ever was any tenderness, right? That word is placed there on purpose because there is some amount of feeling between these two people, but what is going to happen is very dark. And but without getting too far into that, what you call thought weaving, I think um, I think that's a pretty cool way to think of it. But what I was trying to do was, have this, as you said, like it's already in a sense happened. But also with that paragraph that I cut, I had imagined our encounter. It's like what she's imagining. And it kind of goes according to plan, sort of, until we get to that line again. And then, the present tense aligns. And from there on in the story, in the first draft, you're with her in the actual present tense of what's really going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's the imagined encounter versus, this whole idea of framing or seeing and not seeing. And, as you know, in the story, he gives her ways of seeing as this book he loans to her. And then all his ex-girlfriend's phone numbers are listed in the back. And he calls her to, can you look up this number for me? And she's already memorized them all because she's, so obsessive, right? And so, yeah, so I had this formal plan, and I spent ages trying to get it right. I have so many different drafts of this story, and it gets more elaborate and less elaborate and comes around. And eventually I just thought, just tell the story. Just tell the
Yeah.
story. Why are you making it so hard on yourself, And so, yeah. And I think that, just to wrap up, so we can go on, but I think that the elongating of the sort of lead up to the encounter is really, well, at least for me, it's important in this story in a way, because I don't have any desire to read or to write things that are like sort of a microscopic view of a brutal sexual encounter. I don't really care to read it, and I don't really care to write it. That wasn't my intention with this story. I wanted to capture the elusive quality of, this is a pre-Me Too story in such a big way, right?
Oh,
It's
totally.
such a pre-consent, kind of story. And I really wanted to capture something that for me felt very true to experiences when I was of a certain age, where you never knew how to ask for what you wanted. So like that whole idea is like she's willing to do anything, but she really just wanted him to kiss her first,
Yeah.
you know, and he never does, right? And so I wanted to like lead up on the sort of, to elongate the power imbalance in the story, and how there's a certain amount of like very confusing kind of erotic maybe undertone to what's going on, and yet nothing is as it should be.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's part of what's captivating and mortifying about it, right? Including that they've discussed what she wants sexually and what
Exactly.
he wants sexually, and the execution.
Right, she asked for it in some way, right? Because
Yeah,
they talked about what she likes or what she doesn't like. And
yeah, and yet it's so clear within the context of the story, and it's something the story gives us that maybe wouldn't be captured in any other ways, that there isn't consent for this exactly, and her internal struggle to figure out what that looks like and what she can't ask for, right?
yeah,
Uh,
there's a
and
lot of silence between these two people,
yeah,
right? There's not a lot of conversation, at least in terms of dialogue in the story.
yeah,
And that's kind of important. There's like a deep, dark, quiet scariness to those woods, those Pacific Northwest woods. And hearing the birds and hearing the rocks and the dog running ahead. And it's meant to be scary in a way.
Yeah, I've wondered about whether or not that was something that you created consciously. There are a lot of the dialogue is reported, but also a lot of the
Mhm.
spaces are sort of there's space in the space, that the rooms within the context of the MFA, right, aren't terribly fleshed out, but the objects within her working space are very fleshed out. And so there's a lot of, I think, particular focused images, but there's a claustrophobia of not having the room described, but having the objects in the room described, right? Like the things kind of build around you.
I
And
love that.
I'm interested in that a lot in this story. Um, in part because it helps dictate sort of how I experience what I'm hearing, right? That Berger book gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and sort of, even by lighting on him fire, takes it out of that realm of the size of the book and takes it to the realm of the size of logs and limbs that get cut off, by comparison. Or there's this amazing moment where you have that narrator mention Saint Lucia's eyeballs,
Mhm.
that, and it's an abstract thought, but even that starts to, in a world where there are photographs everywhere looking out at you and artistically,
Body parts.
yeah, constantly around you, that it's always looking in on you. And there's
Mhm.
something really, really strange about that, in a good dark way, which leads me to this, rather than just talk about why and how this story makes me nervous, um, as it should. There's, in your original draft, you actually, I assume some of the parentheticals are you thinking out opportunities to
Yeah,
do something differently. Um,
yeah.
do you always do that, and how are you picking those? One image I know I'd mentioned is just the glossiness of riding a wet horse comes up as
Right.
a childhood memory. It's so vivid for me. It almost, there's something sexual about it, but also
Yeah.
not sexual, something very, the openness of it almost lets me out of all that fear, but like comes back on me in this different way because of the water in the last scene. Um,
Right.
so here's my question: is how have you come to some of these decisions?
Well, well, I love what you first said about the objects being sort of more highlighted than than the actual spaces, the rooms. And it's not necessarily something I really have thought about before, but there are these things that get woven in sometimes sort of intuitively, I think, in a story. And like the reference to Santa Lucia or Saint Lucy, I think I call her Saint Lucia, which is why, um, because in Italian she would be Lucia, right? And Lucy just doesn't have the same,
Yeah,
but also it's a shout out for sure to Lucia Berlin. But um, Saint Lucia also is the patron saint of vision, right? And so when she was martyred, they cut out her eyes, and she's always depicted holding them on a plate. And I think it was really the juxtaposition of images there. And I remember writing that scene, and it just came to me exactly that way. It wasn't a scene I changed. It was. Um, I think it's important to show a childhood somewhere, right? And like I said earlier, there's not a lot of tenderness in this story. And there is a dog, and the dog is like the stand-in for the best friend, or um, or whatever in this case. And dogs are in a lot of my stories. And dogs are a great way to sort of do a lot of narrative heavy lifting without having to develop a full character. If if that's of interest to anybody to try, they really can do a lot, or any sort of animal, I suppose, could. But yeah, I think it was just this concept of her framing. She's constantly trying to frame things, right? This character is trying to contain within a sort of frame what she wants the story to be and how she wants to remember it. So sliding, swimming her horse out into the lake and sliding off his glossy back. I think if I had a parenthesis there, it was because it was just this go back and do better, write something more beautiful. I do that while I'm writing when I know it's not good enough, but like I want to keep the momentum going, and I just highlight it or I put a parenthesis around it so I know to go back and fix it. But I don't lose the moment of generating the lines.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. I think there is something about, I don't know if you learned this from Lucia Berlin. As you know, you set me on a Lucia Berlin quest recently. I've been reading a lot of her, and
She's amazing.
there is something amazing about, captivating about trajectory in your work, and so much of Lucia Berlin's work, something propulsive about the way that you get from sentence to sentence, which isn't to say unlovely, but to say that the sentences have their own pace, and the leap from one sentence to the next has a very different pace for me. About
So it's kind of jangly or jarring sometimes.
maybe less jarring than
Unexpected.
unexpected in the way that conversation sort of works, right? Like we're talking over Zoom right now, you're in Rome and I'm in Illinois, and
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about what you say without letting the pause go too long, because I don't know how long it's taken the magic of the internet to carry something over. And also, right, there's something about a drunken conversation that works that way, right? The
If
leaning,
only.
yeah.
If only.
But
Those days are over. But
yeah. But there's something there's something captivating about that movement and the drive of that movement. And so it's wonderful to hear you think out how that movement happens for you. And it's interesting. I wonder if when you read those parens, if you read that sentence one at a time, and then, or you read the paragraph that way, or you're like, it needs to be something more like.
Did I have any that were thought, believed, wondered? Sometimes I just put the words that come and then I go back and then I use none of them, but I know what I'm aiming for.
Yeah.
In college, in grad school, Dan Brown was really big then, and we all loved to hate on Dan Brown. So we would put DB, which was a do better, but it also was Dan Brown, right? I would, for the longest time, I would put DB, next to whatever I knew I had to go back and do better, right? But or if I think maybe I'd like it, but I think it's way over the top, and then I have to decide, can this work? Like that passage I read about the girlfriend and driving over all the stuff. I was like, wow, maybe this is just too much. It's too dense and needs to be cut back. So or edited. So I had remembered really struggling with, was it over the top or should I leave it?
Yeah. I'm glad that's in there in the end. It ends up working. It's a little mortifying for totally different reasons than the rest of the story is mortifying. It's also funny. I love that. In my head, I picture it as McAdam, just being
totally
of pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would love to do that, right? Just to back over somebody's shit in my truck, I would love to have a truck, and in a way, I can imagine being that person and wishing I could just throw somebody's stuff all out in the driveway and just drive over it, but I'm I'm not that cool, probably. You know,
Yeah, I like that you still
but I know
aspire.
someone who did something similar. So some of these things find their way into fiction, you know?
Yeah, it's part of the joy of living a life, right?
Yeah, indeed. But we'll never tell which is real and what's no. But I mean, I don't know about what I learned from Lucia, but I know that, you know, her slippery point of view is something um that maybe held her back for many years, you know, and now is really admired, as well
Yeah,
as like the whole concept of autofiction. You know, I mean, in France, of course, everybody has embraced autofiction forever. You know, there's Proust and Duras and Francois Sagan, and you know, and so Berlin was held back, I think, by a kind of preconceived idea about women writing about their own lives, you know, and I think that held her back. But I think in my work, you know, I don't know what I learned from her, but I learned so much I can't even really articulate it. Um, but it wasn't always just about writing, you know,
yeah,
it just, but I do think that maybe you're right. There's a way that she um, uses place
yeah,
in her work that I really admire and that maybe I aim toward a little bit. You know, like the settings for me, even so much as maybe undescribed settings, as you've mentioned, um, they're still a character for me.
yeah,
And I need it to, you know, I need to sort of feel like the reader can see it. And maybe this is such an early story of mine that there's less description of landscape per se, you know, or internal, at least internal spaces. You know, like you get the bathtub, but you don't get the bathroom, you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
You get the creaky gate, but you don't really get the house.
Yeah, I'd um I'd have to think about that one in terms of how that works with the rest of this collection. I think it definitely there are other stories like a Roman story or a Rome story or Roman story.
A Roman story,
Roman
yeah.
story begins with so much description of the space and the place and the world that those characters are living in. Um,
Hmm.
but it's also a story that goes in a very different uh, direction, right? Like
Sure, yeah.
the way that you're going to relate to that character, the way in which um, the right, like the relevance of the things that are going to happen. It doesn't have that same gothic quality. It's still
Mm-mm.
mortifying, horrifying um,
It is.
ending for sure. But
It's a terrible, terrible. Well, that's a true crime story. I mean, not that I'm a true crime writer, but that's a story. That's something that happened by my house in Rome, and it haunted me for. I walked into the crime scene in the snow, and it haunted me for years. And every time I rode my bike over the bridge, I couldn't get it out of my head. And not to digress too much,
oh
but
no,
I was working on a paper about Flannery O'Connor for a conference and failing miserably at getting it done in time for my conference. And I read a line in a letter to her by Carolyn Gordon, and it was a quote from Henry James, actually, about how you have to plant a stout stake at the beginning of a story for the action to swirl around or to yeah, to kind of move around. And I just got this image in my head, and I'd been thinking a lot about how in Flannery O'Connor's work, violence is ushered, or grace is always ushered in by violence.
hmm,
And I, I, I wrote that story instead of writing my paper. So that opening scene came to me in like one piece. And then I was like, and now what do I do?
yeah,
But I think, you know, we'll talk about that some other day. But, you know, so there's a lot of description there, but I also I wrote it much later, and it's the only story in the collection that has a male narrator, and it's and an Italian narrator at that, and it's certainly probably the only true crime, if you will, story that I will ever write or be inspired by. It's very different from the others.
Yeah. And I
It's
think
like a
that,
bomb that goes off in the book.
yeah, I think that's a fair description of it, right? Like that,
Yeah.
and I think telling about how you've laid the book out and constructed it and put that bomb
Hmm.
in roughly the middle
In the middle, yeah.
of it. I guess here's a ineffectual leap back toward Treeboy.
Sure.
That, I mean, that bomb is sort of a Rome and story is, it's got so much more density in terms of size, in terms of heft, right? To use sort of Calvino's term, I guess I'm thinking Italians now.
Hmm.
Like it has less lightness about it than Treeboy.
Hmm.
Treeboy has a lightness, but despite the weight of the content.
Right.
One of the reasons I think it feels that way is that there's something almost comic about the name Treeboy.
Yeah.
I like the idea of Cricket Boy. That seems even more absurd. But I noticed reading, I was sure in an earlier version of the text when the narrator addressed Treeboy or would address Treeboy, and you'd learn that his name was Dale or something.
He never had a name.
He never had a name. And
He never had a name.
I wonder if you can,
Another name, I should say.
yeah, why, apart from the idea of a book of boys, why Treeboy and what is that doing for you in the story? I think for me, it adds that sense of levity and enigma, I guess, but I don't,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm. I think there's a couple of reasons why. I think um, on some level, it empowers our protagonist or narrator to diminish him in some way, right?
yeah,
And to give him this nickname. um, Women are always called girls, you know, and so he's a man, right? But she thinks of him as Tree Boy, and even calls him Tree Boy in the story. And I think it's just a tiny way she exerts a little bit of power, because it can diminish him a little bit.
yeah,
And it's funny, and it's like it makes the story seem cute at first. Like Tree Boy shows up late for class seems innocuous, right?
yeah,
And so I think in the sense of the boys, or the titles in this particular title, um, she exerts her, where she can, what little power she has, she tries to hold on to it pretty tight.
yeah,
And secondly, I think that when you give a character a name like that, it allows the reader to drop in and replace Tree Boy 4,
mm,
right? Like we've all had an obsessive relationship. We've all had crushes on people who we knew were dangerous for us. We've all known people who were kind of toxic. And so to give him a sort, if I named him Dale, you know, um, or, whatever, Mike, or, Francesco, or whatever. I mean, the minute you give a character a name, your reader forms an image
yeah,
based on their relationship to that name. Oh, I hated that guy in grade school with that name, or oh, I really liked that person, and this character is nothing like that person, and then I don't know. So I like the anonymity of it. I like um, the fact of it being um, a diminutive in a sense, and I just like the way it sounds, Tree
yeah,
Boy.
yeah,
Like it's so perfect, really. It's just
yeah,
these two syllables, and it does so much work in the story. And also because he is Tree Boy, not just because he trims trees, but because he's he's rooted in this place, you know, he's from the Pacific Northwest. He has um history there, even if it's an impoverished one. And she's passing through and doesn't belong and is lost and her compass doesn't work, and you know, so there's all these different like metaphoric ways that I'm playing with, like there's an extended metaphor with, you know, trees and wood and branches and fire and all those things, and water and all those elements, right? And he's this really elemental character
Yeah.
without, though we don't really get to know him that much, but just enough,
Yeah. I
hopefully.
think just, no, I think totally just enough, right? Like there's enough of, because of how the narrator talks about him, deals with her obsession about him, right? Like you're introduced
Hmm.
to what makes him desirable, which is the mystery, the odd rootedness, the ability to, right? Like I had a friend recently who was thinking about applying to a place in West Virginia and was going down fantasies of people that he hadn't even met that would be coal miners that he could find.
Appalachia.
Yeah.
Woo.
Um, and so you see how that happens, and that is so relatable in terms of like, this is why this person is wonderful and why I wanted to work out. But you also get that, you know, reported dialogue of him being a dick and saying, you know, like that her pain isn't good enough, right, to like
Hmm.
manifest art, um, or bullying her about the way she grew up, or you
Hmm.
know, which also presumes his own sort of, right? Like I don't know if people use the word negging anymore, right? Like it presumes something about his goodness and her unworthiness,
Hmm.
and all of that stuff that um, that gets there, um, and should be this warning sign that doesn't quite get to be the warning sign in the way that those things often happen, right?
Right, because there's, you know, the peaches and the, you know, there's little treats,
Yeah,
you know, that come wrapped in other sort of meaning. But yeah, I think the disparity in their upbringing is just kind of laced in there just ever so slightly. But, you know, this is a kind of, I lived in Seattle in the grunge era, right? And so, um, and it was a kind of brief moment in my life. I wasn't there very long because I ended up getting into graduate school and moving away. But I wrote, you know, my very first pieces in Seattle. And, you know, like I was there when Kurt Cobain,
yeah,
you know, came to his horrible demise. And so, you know, that's that Olympic Peninsula that I looked out at, you know, off my attic apartment in Seattle, you know, that's where he hails from, this fictional character, right?
yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think there's this thing that happens in graduate school. There's so much competitiveness, right? And so, of course, I didn't do fine art. I did fiction writing, but it's the same game. And the you know, the entitled versus the you have to suffer for your art, and you know, these things that come about in grad school. People can be ruthless, you know, and or at least when I went to graduate school, not always,
Yeah.
but I would say, you know, between the lines, he's threatened by her work, but and she's probably pretty good photographer, right? But she feels very much in his thrall, and so I don't know.
No, I think that feels true to me, and it's part of the depth of the story, right? And I think all of that supports that notion that there is a power imbalance, right? Like at least
Hmm.
a power imbalance in the way that she desires him, and he knows she desires him, and he's using that as a means by which to not treat her very well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and to do that through his own insecurities and his own
Mm-hmm.
bullshit that slowly develops and becomes apparent throughout the story, and even to sort of like present information like the girlfriend who backs over the, like, you know, it's a woe is me tale as it's reported, right? Like it's too late, I think, is how it's described. Like after he realizes that the girl he cheats with has gone with the
Mm-hmm.
favorite professor on the Fulbright.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of that is subtle but remarkable depth about something that's still ineffable as a relationship.
Right. Well, nothing like trying to, you know, win somebody over by telling them you've cheated on your girlfriend of 7 years and that you know, unfairly been, you know, you've been maltreated yourself by this person you cheated with. You know, it's just, it's such a classic, it's of a certain age, right? When there's no filters in some ways and people tell each other things thinking that they're bonding, but they're each needing to tell their story for different reasons and they're not actually communicating at all. Right. And I guess maybe part of me wanted to sort of capture that, you know, that feeling of being so caught up that you keep trying to say the thing that's going to hook them, you know,
Yeah.
or respond in the way that is the best way to be the cool person who, you know, like she says, you know, I'm listening, but I'm really just listening until he tells me what I want to hear.
Yeah.
You know, like it's a song I want to hear.
Yeah. I love that. It's one of my favorite odd lines that stayed. Here's a hard turn about capturing a moment and naming. 8ball recently got translated to Spanish. Bola Ocho.
Yeah.
Congratulations. That's very
Thank you.
cool.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Very unexpected and super fun.
Yeah. So you're going through that lovely ride right now, but you've also lived a life in several languages and are widely traveled and are in Rome right now because you live there.
Yeah.
But I do feel as though, you know, the fact of your book getting translated is a good opportunity to ask a little bit about the process of translating that age and that time and the specific place of Seattle, among other locations in 8ball, into another language. Even like when you told me that your book had been translated to Spanish, you hadn't mentioned the title in one of our emails. And
Mm-hmm.
I sat there and wondered to myself, like, is cocaine called an 8ball and an
No,
8ball?
it's
Or
called polo. It's
yeah.
called chicken polo. And so they were like, we can't call it polo because it's just so ugly. You know, we went round and round about should it be a direct translation because it's sort of enigmatic because the 8ball in billiards is in Spanish is black ball, the black ball, also in Italian. So bola ocho is sort of more enigmatic in some ways, but they have a footnote. They have several footnotes in the text. The book is very beautiful, actually, the way this is it.
Oh, that's
And
very cool.
they did this beautiful little dust cover thing that when the butterflies land on her hand in this, you know, but in the actual, she's got a cigarette in the cover. Because if you've read it, so in 8ball, the butterflies are kind of an important symbol. I just dropped it, but anyway, yeah, that's it. But translation, you mean translation, not so much in terms of language, but how I translate place? Is that what you were kind of asking about?
I think I was being a little more literal and asking about that process for you of figuring. I understand that you're not the translator, but that opportunity to sort of like think out
Okay.
how to capture
It was,
again.
yeah. I mean, I actually am not fluent in Spanish at all. I studied French. I'm fluent in Italian. which was a sort of learned on the street kind of Italian. But yeah, after so many years here, I speak fluent Italian, and I can read the Spanish because there's a lot of crossover where I can get by in it. But I actually think in Blanca Gago, who was my translator, I'm so fortunate because she took a really deep dive into my book. You know, she really seemed to get it. And she wrote me and introduced herself. She asked me some questions, and they were not very many, considering I say my writing's a little complex. You know, my
Right.
sentences aren't so easy. And truthfully, you know, we were talking about the style of Treeboy, and it's stripped pretty bare. And when I was a grad student, I was really a minimalist. I was known as this minimalist, you know, and I was always like taking stuff out, taking stuff out. And living in Italian has really made my writing kind of baroque, and my sentences got longer and longer and longer as the longer I've lived here and the more I've lived in another language. So I was trying to understand, having translated a bit myself, you know, I used to translate screenplays.
Mhm.
It's really an art form. And I am not really a translator. Like, that was a cool gig that I had when I first moved here. But Blanca, she told me that, you know, her first pass through was really focused on the loss and the pain and the sort of addiction and the darkness. And her second pass through, she realized there were all these plays on, you know, that play on words,
Mm.
different playing on words, you know, instances of that. There was a kind of levity and humor, sometimes dark humor, but that she really appreciated in her second, like, she'd sweep through when she retranslate, like she translated it and then she went through and did another pass through. She really took a lot of time with it. And I've given it to friends who are Venezuelan and Spanish, and they're all kind of like, she really gets you. And it sounds really good in Spanish. So I'm super lucky.
Yeah.
But I didn't, you know, it was also truthfully, you know, kind of like, oh, you know, here, hi, we're your publishers. Like, I had talked to her, but I hadn't talked to my publisher. Hi, we're your publishers. We're so proud of your book. And I was like, great, thanks. When's it coming out? Oh, in 2 weeks. Oh, can I see the cover? Like, I didn't have any contact with them really for like a year and a half. And then bang, it was like mid-January and it was coming out in 2 weeks. And I've been interviewed a bunch of times and I've had a lot of reviews, and it's being taken much more seriously in Spain than it ever was in America. So
That's very cool.
I've been really blessed. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. And thank you for
Thanks.
doing this with us in the interest of getting your book a little more attention in America
Oh, yeah.
and elsewhere. Most of our viewers are from America, also the Netherlands, weirdly. But who knew?
Really?
Yeah. But to that end, where can folks find your book? Where can they find your writing?
So
Where
eight
do you-
ball,
Yeah.
you can buy it straight from Santa Fe Writers Project, which is SFWP.com. My wonderful publisher, Andrew Gifford, who you've had on the interview series, and who scooped my manuscript up out of the slush pile and published it. So there's hope for those of us who are out there
Yeah.
sending our work to people blind, you know. And but Bola Ocho is available in Spanish as well. You know, if you're in the States, you can get it through Amazon. If you're abroad, it's sold in about 300 Spanish language bookstores, and it's all over the place. So they're pretty easy to find. But I mean, I always say support your independent booksellers. You can always order it. You know, and it's nice to say, hey, can you get this book in? And, you know, then it's on the shelf somewhere in your city or wherever, or you can share it with people. It's so much nicer to have like the physical book. I mean, of course, it's also available in ebook form. And my writing, I don't have very much fiction out there, to be honest. I have a lot more essay and interviews and stuff like that, some nonfiction.
Very
Yeah.
cool. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much. I'm so excited we managed to get this done.
Thank you, Adam. I'm really thrilled to meet you and to talk, and I'm so grateful for your kind attention to my story and to my book, and that you read it out loud is just incredible.
So goodbye for now.
Ciao.